All right. Well, welcome. I'm really excited to have on two wonderful guests. We have Tracey DePasquale, who's the director of LAMPA, which is the Lutheran Advocacy Ministry of Pennsylvania. And we have Andrew Fuller, who is the, let me get your title here. Hang on. It's Advocacy Coordinator in the Washington Advocacy Office, Washington, D.C. Advocacy Office of the ELCA. Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to take a moment and allow each of you to give a little bit more information about your organizations. There's people who are going to be watching who have no idea about LAMPA, who aren't Lutheran, or about didn't even know that churches have an advocacy office. So if you don't mind, each of you kind of taking a couple of minutes and just kind of talk a little bit about your focus. Tracey, if you want to go ahead and start, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. Lutheran Advocacy Ministry in Pennsylvania is one of 18 state public policy offices related to or residing within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And our mission is, in response to God's love for us in Jesus Christ, we advocate for wise and just public policies in Pennsylvania. And among the many issues we address would be homelessness, but the core of our work is centered on hunger and poverty. But we work on many issues that are related to hunger and poverty.
Great, thank you. Andrew.
Yes, exactly what Tracey said. At the advocacy office in the national level in Washington, D.C., we work on federal issues as well. My particular role as advocacy coordinator has within it the national housing and homelessness policies. So I work day to day with lawmakers through a government relational capacity, but also a advocacy methodology by working with congregations to equip them with the tools they need to do their own advocacy. So it's both government relations and advocacy work.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And again, since we got a lot of folks who may not be familiar, could you define that term advocacy so that people have a sense of what is that, how it's different than like partisan politics and those type of things? I'll leave that open, whoever wants to handle that.
Tracey, would you like to go?
Well, in the terms of the way we approach it as church is speaking up with and on behalf of those whose voices are not always heard at the seats of power, the poor, the marginalized, all who are made in the image of God and who are worthy of dignity and love. And we help lift up their voices, but we also help Christians to live into their baptismal call to strive for justice and peace. And so as Andrew said, it's twofold. You know, we're lifting up the voices and the needs of those who are often not heard, but we're also equipping people to live into that baptismal call. So we don't just do it as staff. These are things that we engage our congregations in because it's part of their call as Christians.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So let's turn. Andrew, I'm going to ask you about some ELCA initiatives. What are some of the legislation and the policy that you're focusing on right now around homelessness?
For sure. So right now, especially during the COVID pandemic that's facing the nation, a lot of effort is being spent on making sure that whatever responses we have go to the people in the greatest need, as well as the wider economy, to make sure that we don't leave people behind or that we don't cause a major recession in the process. In my personal capacity, what I'm spending a lot of time doing is working on the emergency supplemental response that might be coming down in the next few weeks as lawmakers are continuing negotiations, trying to make sure that a variety of different housing provisions, from expanding a national moratorium on evictions to making sure that renters and other low-income individuals have the resources they need to keep stably housed, and to make sure that shelters have equipped resources that they need from the national level to be passed on to states during whatever transitions they need to be making while trying to be socially distanced and make those accommodations is what I'm working on mostly now. But also trying to make sure that our nation has enough tools during the national budget cycle because what we deal with, it hasn't been a new issue in terms of a slow rise in homelessness and other greater housing needs. So making sure that our annual budget cycle also has those resources upheld.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's folks who are curious as far as how much of a challenge is it in the political environment that exists to get people on the same page. I mean, I'm sure that there's folks who I can't imagine there are people who, or at least very many, who would say, oh yeah, whatever, homelessness, we don't care. But I'm sure there's a lot of folks who would say, yes, we should end homelessness. And there's a lot of division over how do we do that. What have you found effective in trying to get people who say they want the same thing to actually then get on board with some of the initiatives that the church is really trying to move forward?
Well, I would say that everything that we work on personally comes from our core social teaching values. The ELCA in particular has a number of different social statements and other constitutional provisions that basically say, as a church, we sort of upheld these basic principles that we are a public church. We do have these goals that we strive for, not just to do in direct service, but also to address structural issues that for facing people poverty as well. And I would say that that was equally equivalent for pretty much any other denomination or religious background that you can think of. We work in collaboration with other partners all the time. In terms of facing divisions, I think that housing and homelessness has become such a core issue and has been such overlooked for such a long period of time that it's becoming more and more common across partisan lines that this is no longer a really tricky issue. It's become so, the need for housing in general has become so pressing that hospitals are building affordable housing, churches are building affordable housing, and that is just creating long-term savings in the long run on unnecessary medical cost, undue cost on the criminal justice system, and really just upholding our moral fortitude in terms of what are we doing to help the people in the greatest needs and our neighbors without homes. So if you're facing issues, I would just say start local, start with your values, and just move up from there.
That's great. Tracey, how about at the state level? What are some of the things that LAMPA is working on as far as homelessness goes?
Well, pre-COVID or since COVID?
Well, you take your pick. I mean, I know pre-COVID is kind of looking at the longer term, kind of like Andrew was talking about as far as the regular type of things that are going on. Maybe you can address it kind of both as the long term and then in the midst of the pandemic.
Thank you. Well, and first, I would like to say thank you, Pastor Matthew, for what you're about to do. And I guess by the time people see this, it will be what you're in the midst of doing on Monday night, and drawing attention to homelessness and the toll that it takes on those who are experiencing it, individuals and increasingly families across the Commonwealth. We know that before the pandemic, there were more than 16,200 Pennsylvanians who were homeless on any given day. During one school year, school districts and the last reporting year were providing services to about 13,000 homeless children over the course of that school year. And you can just imagine what that does to a child's ability to focus. Being homeless is traumatic, and it should go without saying that that interferes with the student's ability to learn, an individual's family's ability to receive health care and nutrition, to be civically engaged. And I'm grateful that also in this evening that you're also lifting up ways to make sure that people who are experiencing homelessness, even temporarily, have access to the vote, and that you'll be sharing ways that, and people can also be in touch with LAMPA about how congregations can be helpful in that respect too. But we have no doubt that the amount of homelessness could surge at any minute. You know, once the moratorium has been lifted, and we are extremely grateful to Governor Wolf for recently extending the statewide moratorium in both private and public sectors till August 31st. That is a great relief. Our ministries who are feeding the hungry, providing shelter to those who are experiencing homelessness, providing medical care, the many services that we engage in with and on behalf of our neighbors in need, what we're hearing is a lot of anxiety from people who've maybe never been this close to the edge of homelessness before. And we're very, very worried that they were going to soon be out on the street. The state, in the early days of the pandemic, those who were already experiencing homelessness were sheltered with the promise of federal emergency management funds that were going to be coming down the pipeline. But before they could get there, counties had to figure out ways of sheltering people in place. And each county may have used a different pot of funds, but one of the funds that they were able to use was a fund that Lutheran advocates, and certainly we weren't the only ones, but Lutherans advocated for many, many years to get the Fair Housing Fund, known as the Housing Trust Fund, in place, and then to fund it in Pennsylvania. And so they were able to use those funds to help shelter those experiencing homelessness in hotels in their counties. So that's, you know, just one example of how those years of hard work paid off in a crisis. And since then, the federal monies have started to fall into place through the CARES Act. And Pennsylvania took its allocation and said that we were going to put $175 million into mortgage and rental assistance. But, you know, all of this takes time to spool out, you know, from the feds, then to the legislature, and then figuring out how it's going to be enacted. And by the time it was ready to roll out, which was the end of June, like first part of July, we were looking at a July 10th end to the statewide moratorium. And that's why Governor Wolf on July 9th extended the moratorium to August 31st. People should apply if they're in need, even though that moratorium is out there. People should apply as soon as possible for that mortgage and rental assistance program as soon as possible, because the funds are limited, and there's a 6-month limit on them, and they can pay, that can be used to help pay for arrears, you know, going back to March 1st. We have concerns for those, well, because the CARES Act funding was federal funding, it came with certain guidelines attached to it, and that it was specifically directed to those who were affected by COVID. So it really doesn't do anything to address those who maybe got laid off the end of February and who certainly weren't going to find a job in the middle of the pandemic. Those who were already experiencing homelessness before that. And the funds, the resources that are available at the state level to provide services for those folks, that those pools haven't grown. And because the FAIRS Act, the FAIR funding that I referred to previously is based on a portion of the realty transfer tax, and there's not a lot of real estate changing hands during this time, that funding is dropping. So the state resources for addressing that just, they aren't growing. And so if these moratorium aren't extended further till we're out of all of this, we are afraid that we're going to see a massive amount of homelessness. Then the day after Governor Wolf signed the moratorium, he also awarded $19 million to counties for further homelessness assistance and prevention that is targeted more toward folks who have already experienced homelessness, but it's only $19 million. And again, that's coming through the CARES Act. And it's not.
19 million sounds like a lot of money to an individual, but when we're talking about an entire state with, how many millions of people,
right,
how many people would be affected, that's not a lot of money. I do want to turn then to Andrew. You mentioned about a national moratorium, and maybe you can give us kind of an update on where that is and how many people would that impact as well.
Sure. So the national moratorium was limited. That was implemented by the CARES Act, and basically that only applies to federally units that are federally backed with federal backed mortgages or other public housing. So it wasn't a uniform moratorium, and that limited scope actually ends, I believe it's July 25th. So that's coming up, and millions of people could be possibly affected by that. Something like 12 million renters over the past few months have either missed a payment or don't know where their next payment could come in. So it's a real crisis that could suddenly overnight have millions of evictions starting to pile up. And so what lawmakers are going to do during that time is a good question. There's several advocates who are encouraging Secretary Ben Carson of HUD to sort of step in while Congress is deliberating. But in the meantime, it's really important for interested advocates to be reaching out to Congress, because they are having those discussions right now as to what degree should the federal government be getting involved. It's really fortunate that Governor Wolf has set the date back a little further for the state of Pennsylvania, but advocates from Pennsylvania should also be looking across the river and to other areas as well, because this is a huge national scope issue. Yeah,
absolutely. So as we're closing in on just a couple of minutes in the end, I want to ask you, people that are watching, and I just received word today that there's going to be folks in the state of Washington who are also doing a sleep out in the park at the same time. So this is kind of catching both ends of the country in what we're doing here. And I'm wondering, what can people do? What are some simple things that people can do to move in this idea of advocacy, of whether they're faith-filled people or whether they don't have a faith in a particular religious theology or anything like that, but they care about the idea of homelessness. They care about the people who are experiencing it, and they want to do something. What are some things that folks can do, especially in the area of advocacy?
Register and vote, first of all. Study where the candidates are on the issues. And I would say you can look to the success in areas. I would say what's starting to bring about bipartisan support for addressing homelessness has been the success of a lot of the programs around veterans homelessness. The investments made there have really paid off in terms of, not just ending veteran homelessness or seriously reducing it, but in the health and well-being of those veterans. And having an example of what's worked is really encouragement to policymakers to say, well, if it's worked in this category, let's apply it in other areas, because there's savings and better outcomes in the long run.
Andrew, any other additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, as a really easy plug, just for Tracey and I, we both issue out pretty frequent action alerts, updating people on how things are going, both at the state and federal level. So one easy way to keep informed is just following those listservs. But really just calling your lawmakers and doing it frequently. Don't do it just, like once and then like that's it for the year, but the more often they hear from you, the more that impact builds. And they really know to pay attention to a certain issue when someone's calling and it's not in the major news cycle, right? Like that means like, oh geez, like this is something my constituents really care about and I should be paying more attention to. And if you want to go 2 steps further, start hosting conversations with either people in your congregation or people in the community about why those issues are important. And even further, make sure that work it collaboratively with service agencies or your soup kitchen or food pantry, whatever you happen to have, to make sure that people who are struggling with homelessness have access to voting resources, the ability to register to vote, and are able to access public services that they need.
Yeah, go ahead, Tracey.
And one more thing, and this is, I think, one of the beautiful things about faith-based advocacy, but you don't have to be a person of faith to engage in this. And that is to accompany people who are experiencing homelessness or who have experienced homelessness so that they can tell their stories. They've been the most effective advocates across the board. That often, like any of us, we just appreciate having a companion, to accompany someone as they tell their story. It is really effective in opening lawmakers' eyes to just how sometimes, even with the best of intentions, our systems fail.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with all of the things that you have said. I mean, one of the nice things about doing that is it humanizes homelessness. That people that are experiencing aren't just a number. We talk about how many people are experiencing homelessness, and there's large numbers of people, but each of those people have a name and they have a story, and they're fighting against all these perceptions and all this type of stuff, and that just brings it into this is somebody's life that we're dealing with. The last thing I want to ask you is, you mentioned the advocacy alerts, and those are wonderful. And to give people a sense of what those entail is that there's usually, oftentimes it's a focus on one particular subject, and there's actions that people can take, links to representatives' websites, contact forms, or phone numbers. There's already even people can take some partially crafted letter and language that will help people to get started. You can always add in their own personal thoughts, of their own experiences as well. If they know folks who are dealing with whatever the issue is at hand, those are really helpful. And so what I'd like from both of you, Andrew, you can start first, is where do people sign up for those?
Sure. So if you go to elca.org/action center, and I can send you the link, Pastor Matthew, you can sign up pretty quickly just through there. But I would just add as a caveat, definitely personalize your messages, because if you really want to increase your impact, the more you personalize and add local context to these partial letters that we submit, the far more influential they are.
Absolutely. And Tracey, how about for getting the action alerts from LAMPA?
www.lutheranadvocacypa.org.
Wonderful.
And we make our letters editable so that any faith can change the language. You can change the faith language to fit your faith or eliminate faith language altogether. So we have many denominations use our alerts.
And I can say that I have utilized both the LAMPA and the ELCA in doing these things. They're easy to do. I just want to encourage people to, whether you're utilizing these resources or you have other resources, or you just go and contact your legislators about issues around homelessness, I just want to encourage people to do that. It's not difficult, and it does make an impact. I have worked for a member of Congress in the past, and I will tell you that it does make a difference, and it does make an impact. And the more voices that speak up, the better the chance there is that a change and a transformation happens. So I just want to thank you both, Tracey and Andrew, for your time. I appreciate you coming on and talking about advocacy, especially around homelessness. It's been great to have you. Thanks.
Thank you, Pastor Matthew.
Thank you. Best of luck.